Straight talk from Israel. You're listening to Israel News Talk Radio.
Welcome to the Science of Kabbalah with your hosts, Rabbi Yitzchak Michelson and William Hall, here on Israel News Talk Radio.
Shalom, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Science of Kabbalah here on IsraelNewsTalkRadio.com. This is Rabbi Yitzchak, and I am joined by my lovely wife today.
Shalom, everyone.
So William is on the road. He's on the way back from Austin, and in his part of Texas, I guess, service is not so good, so we were having a little problem with the signal, so we decided for the rabbi and rabbinit to do the show together today. And I'm really excited about the show today.
I'm excited about the show also.
I'm excited because I don't even know where to start. There's so many things that I want to talk about. Actually, even though this Shabbat coming up, we're going to be in Parshat Lech Lecha. We just read Parshat Noach about Noah and the Ark, and then it ends sort of just before the journey of Avram, before he becomes Avraham, or Abram before he becomes Abraham. And we have the Tower of Babel. We have the whole building of the Tower of Babel. So we have a very interesting Parsha with Noah and the Ark, and what we call the generation, or the Dor HaMabul, the generation of the flood. And then towards the end of the Parsha, we have what's called the Dor Haflaga, the generation of division. And there's just so much in this Parsha that I've studied, but I've never really talked about, and I never really elaborated on it. And maybe that's because it's related to the sign of the times, and that's why I'm so excited about talking about it today.
Very exciting. We talked about it a little bit over Shabbat, and looking forward to it.
So what we're going to be talking about, like I said, is the generation of the flood and the generation of the division. And really I'm seeing so many of the things play out today. And if I was going to come up with a title for the show, I think what I would call it is when generations collide, or when generations collide, basically. We're talking about these two generations colliding, and what happens. Not only is there a collision that causes a separation, but there's a collision that actually causes a unification as well. And I know that sounds a little bit weird, but hopefully we'll be able to make sense of it. So stick with us. We're going to be right back after a short break here on the Science of Kabbalah on IsraelNewsTalkRadio.com.
Israel is located in one of the most volatile areas in the world. Israel is an island of stability in a sea of war and unrest. In the midst of this turmoil, Israel stands out as a beacon of order and human progress. Each week we update you on what's happening in this, the Jewish state, a true light unto the nations. This is Jay Shapiro. Join me every Thursday on Israel News Talk Radio.
Welcome back to Science of Kabbalah with Rabbi Yitzchak Michelson and William Hall, here on Israel News Talk Radio.
Welcome back, everyone, to the Science of Kabbalah here on IsraelNewsTalkRadio.com. Rabbi Yitzchak here, along with
Leah,
my amazing wife, talking about Parshat Noach. We just kind of gave a little bit of the information during the intro in talking about when generations collide, talking about the generation of the flood and the generation of division. But you know what's interesting is that nobody ever really talks about Noach's wife. We see that his sons are spoken about, and we know what's happening during the generation. One of the things that we need to understand is the distinction between the two. When you talk about the generation of the flood, or what we call the Dor HaMabul, usually the commentators will say that it was sort of an orgiastic society, meaning that it was all about pleasure, it was all about sexual immorality and so forth. Whereas the Dor Haflaga, this generation of division, was really more unified in the sense that people weren't individualistic. They were coming together. They just had one language. They had, everything sort of in common.
Assimilating, would you say?
Assimilating
Or
in the
not
sense
ending
that,
later?
assimilating in the sense that they were all sort of following the same shita, following the same, way, so to speak, and deciding to come together and kind of taking Hashem, taking the Creator out of the equation and saying, we're going to build this tower, basically wanting to take over not only earth, but wanting to take over Shemayim as well, take over heaven as well, and get Hashem out of the picture. So
I'm interested, you mentioned about Noach's wife.
Yes, I just wanted to preface it with the idea that we know that this was a generation of moral decay, and we know that the Parsha starts off with Ele toldot Noach ish tzaddik, that Noach is a righteous man, and then it says Tamim haya b'dorotav, that Noach was righteous and he was blameless in his generation, and it says Hitalech Noach, that Noach walked with God. But what's interesting is that the very next verse talks about Noach's sons. It says that he has 3 sons. He has Shem, he has Ham, and he has Yafet. But nothing is said about his wife. Nothing said about the woman behind this sort of illustrious man, this righteous man. How many times do we read about different men in the Bible? We talked about Avram, who became Avram. And of course, there's a lot about Sarai, about his wife Sarah. And you talk about Yaakov, and we hear about, Rachel and Leah and all the different wives, but nothing about Noach.
Interesting.
So when Noach is informed, right, he's informed that there's an impending disaster coming, that there's going to be this flood that's going to destroy the whole world, right? And that it's going to wash away most of humanity. And he's also told at the same time that his family is going to be saved. It says, and behold, I myself bring a flood of waters upon the earth to destroy all flesh that possesses the breath of life from under heaven, and everything that is on the earth shall die. But with you will I establish my covenant, and you shall come into the ark, you and your sons and your wife and your sons' wives with you. That's from Genesis chapter 6, verse 17 and 18. Now, isn't it interesting that it says that the sons, your sons and your wife? How come it doesn't say your wife and your sons' wives? It has the sons first. It's kind of curious when you think about it, that it has the sons first. So Rashi comments on Breshit, on Genesis chapter 6, verse 18, that the reason it says you and your sons and your wife is because there is in the Talmud in Sanhedrin 108b a reference to the idea that there was not going to be any intimate relations on the ark, that there was not going to be any marital relations, that the men were going to be separate and the women were going to be separate, that basically everybody was going to be helping Noach take care of all these animals and doing all the work, how they would even have time for anything else.
It was a lot of work to be done.
Right. So it actually says in Sanhedrin 108b in the Talmud that Noach is having a conversation with the raven that's sent out, and he says, a wicked one, he calls the raven. It says, Amal lo rasha, he says, wicked one, if with the woman who is generally permitted to me, meaning my wife, that there's marital relations is forbidden to me, then with regard to domesticated and undomesticated animals, which are generally forbidden to me, is it not all the more so that that in that case they are forbidden to me as well? And then it goes on and it talks about this idea and asks the question, where is this derived from, this prohibition for them to kind of refrain? And it says the Gemara answers that it's derived from that which is written, and you shall come into the ark, you and your sons and your wife and your sons' wives with you. And it is written, emerge from the ark, you and your wife and your sons wives with you. You see, it changes. And Rabbi Yochanan says, from here the sages derived and said that it was prohibited to engage in marital relations while in the ark, as when Noach and his family entered. The husbands and wives were listed separately and when they emerged, the husbands were listed with their wives. So that's what Rashi brings. Now, the other strange thing that we learn is the fact that Noach is instructed to separate from the mother of his children while on the ark, but there's nothing else in the text of the Torah about who this woman is. We don't know anything about her. And although the Torah is silent, tradition actually identifies Noach's wife by name when you look at the genealogical record at the end of I think it's Breshit chapter 4. And how do we get there? It has to do with another interesting note here is that we find it from the name Lamech or Lemech in Hebrew. And because we see two different people with that name. Interestingly enough, one of them, Lamech, is the father of this woman who we're going to say was Noach's wife. And the other Lamech is actually the father of Noach.
So we have two.
We have two Lamechs.
In which we are seeing a lot of twos.
Yeah, two Lamechim.
Yeah.
I don't know. Call them Lamechim. They must be. They're masculine. But anyway, so we begin with that idea of Lamech. And I said it's ironic that Noach's father was also called Lamech, but you'll see that they're completely different people.
They're not related.
They're not related at all. So Rashi makes the connection between this child born to Lamech, and it's Lamech and the woman who was his wife who had this child was named Tzila, and this unnamed wife of Noach, which we'll get to. So we don't have any confusion. If we look at Genesis chapter 4, we'll see the distinction between these two Lamechs that we're talking about. And you're going to be very surprised to find out who we can trace this woman back to.
I'm waiting.
You're waiting. I'm trying to get there. I'm trying the best I can, as fast as I can go. So starting in Genesis chapter 4, verse 17, it says, Cain knew his wife, and she conceived and bore Chanoch, or Enoch. When he built a city, he called the name of the city after the name of his son, Chanoch. To Chanoch was born Irad, and Irad fathered Mehuahel, and Mehuahel fathered Methusalel, and Methusalel fathered Lamech. And Lamech took two wives. The name of the one was Adah, and the name of the other was Tzilah. Adah bore Yaval. He was the father of those who dwell in tents and have livestock. His brother's name was Yuval. He was the father of all those who play the lyre and harp. And then in verse 22, Tzilah also bore Tubal Cain. He was the forger of all instruments of bronze and iron. The sister of Tubal Cain was Naamah. So we have that Breshit traces the family line of this woman named Naamah back to Cain, and the 5th chapter of Breshit gives us the family line of Noach, which begins with Seth or Shet. And these are in fact, again, like I said, distinct, independent families that only merge in the union of Noach and Naamah, who coincidentally had fathers with the same name. I mean, you can't, this is like, you can't make this thing up. This has to be a God thing.
Wow.
This has to be a Torah thing. It's not, this is like the first Peyton place. You think about it.
It sounds like it, right? For those of you that remember that.
Yeah. So by looking at these genealogies, they're not only quite distinct, they're actually qualitatively different. But really, if you really want to fully understand the significance of the union of Noach and Naamah, you have to take a step back and kind of view the larger picture of this whole thing. Noach's wife is identified as Naamah, the daughter of Lamech and Tzila, as we said. Basically what happens is the oral Torah, the Torah Sheba'al Peh, usually fills in a lot of details for us, like we saw with Sanhedrin 108b, about the idea of them not having marital relations in the Teva, in the Ark, and so forth. But really, when we delve into this woman's background and her life story, the more we understand the story of the flood, the Dor HaMabul, the generation of the flood, the more it becomes apparent that the sages, that Chazal did not identify Noach's wife as Na'amah in some sort of arbitrary way, just based on biblical names and characters, that there was a reason for it, and that it could only be that this woman, Na'amah, could be Noach's wife. We're going to have to go to a quick break, but when we come back, we're going to talk more about this and more about the Dor HaMabul and the Dor Haflaga. So stay with us. We'll be right back here on the Science of Kabbalah on Israel News Talk Radio.
The Tamar Yona Show.
Tamar? She's sassy.
She's smart.
She's funny.
But she's also a real Jewish mother.
Hi, everybody. I'm Tamar Yona. And yes, I can be all of those things. But at Israel News Talk Radio, I'm here to bring you the news stories and guests that you may not hear anywhere else. Join me live on air Sundays, Mondays, and Tuesdays for the most unique and bold talk radio in Israel.
The Tamar Yona Show.
Psalm 23, the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. Did you know this psalm and many others were composed by a Jewish shepherd and musician who later became a king? Would you like to know some of the inner meanings of psalms to help you connect with God and strengthen your soul? An exciting and easy-to-read book is now available which will help you do just that. Software for the Soul, Psalms for Everyone, available on Kindle, Audible, and Amazon.com. Software for the Soul.
Welcome back to Science of Kabbalah with Rabbi Yitzchak Michelson and William Hall here on Israel News Talk Radio.
Shalom and welcome back to Science of Kabbalah. And wow, what an incredible show we are having. Really exciting. Previously, we were talking about the Dor Haflaga and the Dor HaMabul. And we also brought up regarding Noach's wife, Na'amah, and it was really interesting learning about her and the line that she comes from, that she descends from Cain. And you brought up something very interesting that really struck me, where you also talked about where Cain, it's out of Bereshit 4:17, where Cain knew his wife and she conceived and she bore Hanoch. And then he built a city and called the city Hanoch after his son. Mm-hmm. So I thought that was very interesting because here we talked about this is the first city that was built. So we're seeing some things from the line of Cain.
Yes.
Very pivotal time.
Right. And what I want to say is that I think it's important because I want people to hear what we're saying, but I don't want it to be so focused on the idea of, obviously it has to be focused on the biblical characters that we're talking about, but I'm trying to see if we can find a connection to what we're seeing going on in the world today. Sort of pre-pandemic, before the coronavirus came in, where you could say that things were sort of in a way like the Dor HaMabul, like the generation of the flood, where everything was cool and people were having a good time and everybody was about their business and the pleasure. And then we have this collision with the pandemic, and it sort of looks like the Dor Haflaga with this idea of a generation of division, where now it's like you have certain segments of the populations coming together and sort of, in a spiritual sense, wanting to build a tower, like taking God out of the equation, and you can only say what they want you to say, and you can only do what they want you to do, and you can only be what they want you to be. And if you're not with them, then you're against them, and you're not part of this collective, so to speak, that's coming together. Like the Borg.
Like the Borg. We think so much alike. Yeah. I think we absolutely can connect this. I mean, everything that Hashem shows us in Torah, even though it can be from hundreds and thousands of years ago, we see that also with the tzaddikim that we study and the things that they bring out from many years ago.
Right.
And how it all connects.
Right. And the most amazing thing is, from when you're talking Kabbalah, the Zohar, when you look at Noach, the Zohar and Parshat Noach, it starts off talking about this Rabbi Chiya, is the one who starts off. It says, Rabbi Chia Patach. Rabbi Chia opens up and talks about this verse from Genesis 6:9, the idea that Noach was a righteous man. And it goes into the idea that sort of at the end, it talks about, at the end of the beginning of what Rabbi Chia says, he talks about this idea of happy is Israel, who occupies themselves with the Torah and are familiar with its paths through which they will merit the world to come. Now, isn't it interesting that he talks about that, the importance of keeping the proper paths of Torah related to the concept of Noach being righteous. And why does he bring that up? He brings that up because when you look at that generation that we're talking about, a generation where we're talking about sexual immorality, when you look at the Eitz Chaim, you look at the way the Eitz Chaim is set up, we have the different sfirot. Noach would be connected to Yesod, the sfira of Yesod, which is foundation. And Yesod, when you look at Yesod as sort of, when you look at the sfirot as a body.
Right. Isn't the Yesod connected to the Brit?
Yesod is connected to the Brit. And the Brit being like the Brit Milah, the circumcision. So it's related to the sexual organ and it's related to sexual purity. So when Yesod is connected to Malchut, which is the level that we live on, the world we live in Malchut, then everything is sort of copacetic. So when you have somebody like Noach, this righteous person, keeping us connected to the holiness, then you have light when Yesod is connected. Because remember, Malchut doesn't have any light of its own.
Right.
It's like the moon.
Like the moon, right.
Which only receives light from the sun.
Right.
So when Yesod is connected to Malchut, then the light that filters down from above, the Shefa, the bounty that flows down from Hashem through the Sfirot, we get light into Malchut. But when there's the separation, when you have a separation, in other words, when you have a generation like the generation of the Haflaga, of the division, where everybody was trying to come together and do their own thing, but coming together unified as a collective, they were looking to the wrong side of the tree of life. They were trying to connect to the left side, and they were disconnecting Yesod from Malchut. And when they did that, there was no longer light, and then there was darkness. And in many ways, this is what I see happening today. I see that when people are trying to do this, that even in a spiritual sense, some people think that they're doing the right thing spiritually, but they're connecting to the wrong side of the tree when they're going out and doing some of the things that they're doing and connecting with some of the people they're connecting with and following some of the people that are teaching Torah today that honestly shouldn't be teaching what they're teaching.
You know, I was just thinking about because we see that Yesod is in the middle. And I don't know why I just thought of a balance beam and balancing. And so people are losing their balance with this.
Sure.
Literally falling off the beam and needing to get back into that, finding that center again.
Right. So when you look at this, when we look back at the verse that you mentioned in this idea that Cain knew his wife, and of course this is right after he kills his brother. This is after the death of Hevel, Abel in English, and he conceived and bore Chanoch, Enoch in English. And it says that Cain built a city and called the name of the city after the name of his son Chanoch. So here we have a connection with Cain now building a city. And what do we say at the end of Parshat Noach? What happens is they say they have one language, they have everything in common, so to speak. They say, let us make bricks and let us build the city. So we have the beginning of industrialization with Cain building a city, naming it after his son. And then we have, at the end of Parshat Noach, the same kind of thing. So the question you have to ask yourself when we start talking about genealogies and lineages is, who are you connected to when you start talking about spirituality?
Ah, whose genes are you connecting with?
Yeah, and we're not talking about blue genes.
No. No. Wow.
Are you manifesting the genes of Cain, or are you manifesting the genes of Hevel? One brought an offering that was acceptable to Hashem. The other one was not acceptable to Hashem, got upset about it. Hashem rebuked him for it. He ended up killing his brother. He ended up putting this whole thing into motion. And what do we see?
The first murder.
The first murder. What's interesting is that if you would look, and I don't know that we have time, but for those of our listeners, if you want to look at those verses that I talked about in Genesis 4 and 5 and so forth in these genealogies, you will see that one of the Lamechs is the second murderer.
Wait, what?
What?
Okay.
Right. So what ends up happening is, all right, so after we get into this concept, maybe we'll see if we can go there. Okay. So we see that Cain moves on with his life, right? He builds a city and he names it after his son. And ironically, or perhaps defiantly, Cain, who is condemned to wander the earth in punishment for the murder of his brother, is the first person to attempt to build an urban center, like we see in the days of Nimrod at the end of Parshat Noach. And the name he chooses for his son and for the city he builds, Chanoch, actually has the connotation of to establish. It's from the word to establish. So Chanoch in turn has a descendant named Lamech, who starts a family in an interesting fashion. He takes not one but two wives. And we read that from Genesis 4:18 and 19. And then Rashi talks about this idea of taking two wives, and he talks about it being in negative terms, because he says this is the behavior of the generation of the Mabul, to take two wives like that, because one wife was taken solely for utilitarian purposes. She was the one who was going to bear children and work in the household and take care of everything. And the other one was really designated simply for pleasure. They would have made her infertile by means of some kind of potion they would have given her so that she wouldn't have children, for the sake of her remaining, having a figure.
Keeping her figure.
Right, so she didn't gain weight and she had a figure, and basically the biblical version of a trophy wife. But we know that that's not the main sin of the transgression of that generation. Rashi actually talks about it having to do more with robbery, but we also hear a lot about sexual immorality.
You talk about robbery, and we're talking about what's going on now, which I'm sure we'll touch on more, but I mean, you see a lot of robbery, you're seeing murders, just incredible, crazy things going on right now. Right.
So when we go to Lamech, so Lamech was the first to create the impossible situation of eating the cake and having it too, right? Because he had one wife for work and one wife for play. While this is not the only incidence in Bereshit in which a man takes two wives, in no other case did the man set out to do it as a premeditated course of action. In other words, there were others that took two wives, but they didn't it wasn't like a premeditated thing. We see it with Esav and other people as well. The question is, getting back to this idea of what we're talking about, we have to see that Lamech was more than just a trendsetter, meaning he was more than just a guy that was like a cake and eat it too kind of guy, because his behavior represents a corruption of the morals upon which society was supposed to be based. When Lamech took two wives, he expressed a much larger, much more deeper egocentric attitude. The idea of what's in it for me, what do I gain from this relationship? But we're going to have to go to a break, and when we come back, hopefully we'll be able to make more sense of this. And like usual, we'll probably run out of time like I do with William.
Always.
But stick with us. We'll be right back here after a short break on the Science of Kabbalah on IsraelNewsTalkRadio.com.
In a time where feelings have become fact, where rational thought and common sense has disappeared, one man stands above it all.
I'm Howie Sobiker, your political hitman.
Political Hitman airs every Tuesday at 11:59 p.m. North American time, 7 a.m. Israeli time, only on Israel News Talk Radio.
Are you interested in transforming your life, drawing closer to the Creator, and uncovering the deeper meanings and hidden treasures in the Hebrew Bible?
Then join me, Rabbi Yitzchak Michelson,
and me, William Hall,
on the Science of Kabbalah, where we are seeking to narrow the gap between what we understand of our physical and spiritual worlds. So make sure to tune in every Tuesday at 5 p.m. Israel time, 10 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, here on Israel News Talk Radio.
Welcome back to Science of Kabbalah with Rabbi Yitzchak Michelson and William Hall here on Israel News Talk Radio.
And we are back here with the final segment of the Science of Kabbalah here on IsraelNewsTalkRadio.com. So before the break, I was mentioning this idea of taking two wives, and that it's not necessarily a new thing. We've seen that with others who were saying that Lamech was sort of one of the only ones that was premeditated in his idea of doing that. In other words, he specifically chose to have one wife to do the work and bear their children, and another one to sort of have a trophy wife. And the only other one that we can see that would be similar would be Esav. And it's really no surprise that when you look at Esav and his choice, and then even the people that descended from Esav, the same way that we're talking about these generations, like Cain, who descended from Cain, and the way that they, this idea of genes that we were talking about, like whose genes you're manifesting. Esav, in many ways, it was sort of like used Lamech as a role model, sort of. And then you see that most of Esav's descendants are also people in that same line, that they manifested the genes of Esav.
It was the same thing over and over.
Yeah, basically.
Down the generations.
So we said that Lamech wasn't a trendsetter in this. But I think I mentioned this, and if I didn't mention it, then I thought it in my head and didn't mention it. But it was this idea of, when we're talking about Cain being the first murderer, and we're talking about these people that manifest these different genes, that I said that Lamech, interestingly enough, that Lamech, the one who took two wives, is known as the second person in the Torah that actually committed murder. And we see that in Genesis chapter 4, verse 23, when it says, Lamech said to his wives, to Adah and Silha, hear my voice, you wives of Lamech. Listen to what I say. I have killed a man for wounding me, a young man for striking me. And then it says in verse 24, if Cain's revenge is sevenfold, then Lamech's is 77-fold. Some of the commentators actually believe that the person that Lamech killed was actually Cain. So there's another interesting.
Wow.
There's another interesting
like a turn of
note,
events.
A turn of events. So it really comes down to this idea of the kind of manifestation of genes. Again, we're not talking about blue genes. We're talking about who are you connected to spiritually. When you start talking about these things like Cain building a city to establish after his son Hanoch, and it's kind of the first industrialized city. And then you're talking about the Dor Haflaga, the generation of division that we talk about towards the end of the Parsha of Noah. As a matter of fact, I'm looking at it now, and it says here, Vayehi chol haaretz sefa echat udvarim achadim, that the entire earth was of one language and uniform words. I'm always amazed when I read that. It's one thing to say, Vayehi chol haaretz sefa echat, that the entire earth had one language.
But uniformed. But
why does it say udvarim achadim? Why does it say that they have uniform words? Why? It seems like it's superfluous. Why? It's almost like redundant. You already said that they had one language. Why does it have to be this idea of uniform words? And that's where it gets back into that idea of the collective that we were talking about. We made a joke about it, about the Borg.
Right.
But really, if you see what's going on in the world today, there really is sort of this collective. And I know some people might get upset with me sort of bringing some of these things up. But when you look at things that are going on, let's say in the United States right now with Antifa and the BLM movement and different movements. I mean, yesterday they had a parade, sort of a car parade, supporting President Trump.
It was the Jews.
Right.
It was Jews for Trump.
And I'm not talking about politics now. No. This has nothing to do with politics. No. I'm not suggesting anything about politics. I'm not telling you who to support, who to vote for, who to be for.
No, we all have a choice.
But the idea is that when a group of Jewish people go out and decide that they're going to drive around and they're going to support a particular candidate, to be treated the way they were treated, where they were attacked, families were attacked, children were attacked, slurs, paint was thrown on their cars, cars were attacked, eggs were thrown. And I want to tell you that I watched a video and there were New York City policemen standing up and down alongside, and they watched people rip flags off of cars. They watched people throw things at cars, and they did absolutely nothing. And this drives me crazy. This is the ultimate of what we're talking here, that not only are you looking at a generation that has one language, but you're looking at a generation that has uniform words. There's a collective now that's coming together where a segment of the society is like the Dor Haflaga that's saying, you must follow like us. You must be like us. You must speak like us. You must have the same paths and ways as us. If you're at a restaurant and you're eating and you don't raise your fist or you don't say the same things we say, then we're going to disrupt your lives.
Right. And the wording needs to be uniformed, is what they're saying.
The wording needs to be uniform. You need to say Black Lives Matter. You can't say All Lives Matter, because once you say All Lives Matter, you're off script.
And I'm going to interject, because when we say all lives matter, all creation matters.
Absolutely.
Every single person matters. But when you start to take it, as some are doing it, into their own hands and making a collective, it brings destruction.
Absolutely. And the very next verse, after we see that verse that talks about them having one language and having uniform words, it says, and it came to pass when they traveled from the east that they found a valley in the land of Shinar and settled there. That's in chapter 11, verse 2. From a Kabbalistic standpoint, what do we learn that this means, traveling from the east? It means that they traveled from Gan Eden, that they were leaving a place of purity, of holiness, and from this garden, they split and they ended up in a valley, in the valley of Shinar, and they decided to settle there. And what's the very next thing that they did? And they said to one another, come, let us make bricks and fire them thoroughly. So the bricks were to them for stones, and the clay was to them for mortar. And they said, come, let us build ourselves a city. The same way that Cain built a city, and a tower with its top in the heavens. And let us make ourselves a name, lest we be scattered upon the face of the entire earth. And then, of course, we know the rest, that Hashem descended to see the city and the tower, and that the sons of man had built. The sons of man, Bnei Adam. Why is that important? Because we're talking about the sons of Noach at the beginning of this. And if we know that there was a deluge, there was a flood, and the whole world was going to be destroyed, why are they not called the sons of Noach now? They're called the sons of Adam. They're called the sons of Adam because it goes back. When we're talking about going back to genes, and we're talking about Gan Eden and how they left Gan Eden, it's that idea of the separation that we talked about of Yesod from Malchut,
right?
Of this idea of darkness. And they're connected as Bnei Adam, as sons of Adam, because it goes back to the original sin of not following the proper paths of Torah, like we read about in the Zohar. I want to read to you something that's from the commentary of the Rav. The Rav was Rav Soloveitchik, father of the modern Orthodox movement, and this is his commentary on Come Let Us Make Bricks. He says the construction of the tower represented industrialization. He says the society enslaved the individual, not to other individuals, but to the state, to the collective, to the group. Unlike the Dor HaMabul, the generation of the flood, who were not disciplined, since orgiastic man was never disciplined, the Dor Haflaga, the generation that built the Tower of Bavel, were disciplined and well organized. They had a strict political code. They were not weakened by abundance. Their character was not softened by overindulgence, by luxurious living. They were aggressive in undertaking, bold in design, and arrogant in execution. The ideology, listen to this, what Rav Soloveitchik says. This is the last line in his commentary on the bricks. He says, the ideology of Marxism, as interpreted by Lenin And Mao Zedong could not have found a better portrayal than in these verses. I want to tell you that when you're talking about Marxism, there's no greater threat for those of you that are listening in the U.S. right now. Again, this is not about my politics or any other politics. But when you're looking at what's going on in the U.S. right now, it's pure and simple Marxism that's being espoused by some of these groups. And here, Rav Soloveitchik, so many years ago, from this very Parshat of Noach, shows you the connection, where these generations collide, where a generation that started out as orgiastic came into a generation of industrialization, of one language, having uniform words, coming together and trying to change the landscape of our culture and society today. So I just want to tell you that that you really need to look at this. And thank God we're coming into Lech Lecha. Thank God we have Avram, whose father, who was an idol maker, who some believe made tshuva, went with his son and left a land and left this area of the Chaldees where they tried to build this city and this tower. And we have a man that looked to the stars and realized that there was a creator in heaven. And rather than trying to take over the heavens and trying to have one language and one collective and one group, he wanted to look to the one and only creator of the heavens and the earth for the proper way. And the proper way is only the Torah.
Amen. Baruch Hashem is what we should all be doing.
As usual, we're out of time. Thank you, everybody, for listening every week. Stay with us every Tuesday here on IsraelNewsTalkRadio.com. Shalom, shalom.
Where can you get the inside news on Israel? At Israel News Talk Radio, we're dedicated to sharing Israel's inside story with the world by providing our listeners with news on Israeli politics, current affairs, and Israeli Jewish culture. The Israel News Talk Radio homepage also provides you, the listener, with useful information at your fingertips, with scrolling news headlines, weather, currency exchange, Shabbat candlelighting times, and so much more. Our radio programming is always accessible and on demand. We operate absolutely free of charge for everyone, everywhere. If you love what we do, partner with us now by becoming an Israel News Talk Radio supporter. With your support, you'll be inscribed on our Israel News Talk Radio Wall of Fame. There's nothing like us in the world. Be part of something great. Israel News Talk Radio. Straight talk from Israel.
Howdy, this is Rita from League City, Texas, now living in Israel. And though my heart may have belonged to Texas, it now belongs to Israel and all the fantastic show hosts at Israel News Talk Radio.
Hi, this is Michael Solomon from Kiryat Arba, Israel. And why do I love listening to Israel News Talk Radio? Because I love listening to the interesting interviews they do and their news reporting that most other media sources don't cover.
Hey, this is Nicoleko from Malmö, Sweden. It gets pretty cold here in Sweden, so I love cuddling up with a warm cup of tea while I listen to Israel News Talk Radio.
Hey everybody, this is Frank Morris from Tennessee. Me and my dog Buster really love listening to Israel News Talk Radio.
You're listening to Israel News Talk Radio.
News, opinion, and more. You're listening to Israel News Talk Radio.